family, child rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
One of the things you know that we talk about so often here on Point of View is apologetics. We understand how important it is for you to know how to articulate a biblical worldview, but you also need to know how to defend a biblical worldview, and that comes from 1 Peter 3:15, where we're actually admonished to always be prepared to make a defense. But the other part of that sometimes gets missed, and that is we're supposed to do that with gentleness and respect. Now, I will certainly say that many of the people we've had on this program over the years that deal with this area of apologetics or the defense of the Christian faith certainly are gracious individuals indeed. But there's a lot we can learn about building bridges, and that's another theme that we've had in this program as well, the need for civility and grace. And this book really pulls together all of that. So I've really been looking forward to the opportunity today to interview Lindsey Medenwaldt, and she is the Director of Operations at an organization we think very highly of, Mama Bear Apologetics. Also serves as an adjunct professor at Northwestern College in Iowa. She has her master's in apologetics and ethics from Denver Seminary. And matter of fact, one of the endorsement comes from our good friend Doug Groteis, an individual that used to be on Probe staff and a frequent guest here on Point of View, as well as an individual that also has a law degree from St. Mary's School of Law. She has written quite a bit on this issue of apologetics and worldview. We have a link to her website, Lindsey Medenwaldt. You don't even have to know how to spell her last name because it's on the website at pointofview.net, and also information about this book, which is published by our good friends at Harvest House. Probably you'll be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have a way in which you can get it in paperback or Kindle. 250 pages, and Lindsey, welcome to Point of View.
Hi, Kerby. I'm so glad to be here.
We'll think very highly of you. And, of course, the introduction or foreword done by Hillary Morgan Ferrer. Of course, we've known her for a long time. And Mark Middleberg and all sorts of other people. Wynn Cordown, I just quoted him the other day. All sorts of endorsements for this book. But bring us to the importance of this topic, because later on you do talk about some of the myths about apologists and that they're oftentimes not gracious. But let's be honest, some are not. And more importantly, as soon as sometimes I teach at a conference, or even as we teach here on the program, I warn people not to get maybe too arrogant, or maybe too dismissive of arguments, because it does seem to me that once we begin to become equipped to answer people's questions, we need to also follow the admonition to do it with gentleness and respect, don't we?
Right. Sometimes we lose that. We get so excited about sharing our faith and the opportunity to talk about Christianity and why we believe what we believe that we forget to take the time to listen to the other person that we're speaking with, and forget that this is usually in a situation where we're in a dialogue with other people. And I don't think we go in it with into the situation with this idea that we're going to attack the person, but we also want to share truth. And in my opinion, I think that most people just get overly excited. Either that, or they get really nervous and flustered, and they're afraid that they're going to say something wrong. And that could come off as sort of arrogant too, because then they're like, well, I know this is true, and you are definitely wrong. And so my hope is that this is an opportunity where people who have studied a little bit of an apologetic, whatever that might be, really starting point, why is the Bible true, right? Why can we believe that Jesus is who he says he is? Taking that information and how to share it well, overcoming the fears of maybe even getting rejected or saying the wrong thing. I see this frequently in the college students that I teach. They are very firm in their faith most often because they come to a Christian college. They want to be taught by Christian professors. They want to continue in their faith in whatever field they choose, but they are a little bit tentative about sharing that faith because they don't want to get it wrong. So hopefully this book helps people feel a little bit more confident.
Well, and again, I think it's important because you found at seminary that you would read some of these books by apologists. And again, you went into it in large part because you wanted to understand some of the things your husband was talking about at the time. Yep. But you did see words like war and opponent and battle. Sometimes when we would come back from the campuses, Doug Gortice and myself and many of the probe speakers and all the rest, we would talk about war stories. And then we said, okay, it really is a war, and we didn't pick a fight, but we weren't going to back away from one either. But there is kind of a mindset that says when I enter into even a discussion about theology, about the gospel, about the Bible, it's a war. But I think what you're trying to help us understand is sometimes they have that mindset. We don't have to reciprocate. If anything, we should not try to build barriers. We should try to build bridges. Is that fair?
Right. I think that's very fair, Kerby. It's a fair reading of what I was trying to explain as well. I have seen lots of verbiage used from various apologists about this battle. And I think sometimes we have taken this, what we read in the Bible about a spiritual battle that we're fighting, and that there is a spiritual battle happening. And we certainly need to be equipped with that, with the full armor of God or other ways that God has given us to defend him in various ways. But we don't have to pretend there's a battle here in real life, not spiritually, but physically, right? I think sometimes when we're starting to think of people as opponents, the words that we speak aren't kind, or we fail to see the person. We start to just identify that person with the idea that they hold and forget to understand why they hold that idea. How can we combat the idea and not the human being? Remembering that the human being is made in God's image and is valuable to him, and God wants to call them his own, right? And we have the opportunity to show them the hope within us, not the battleground that we hope to fight on.
Right. Better to see them not as opponents or as the enemy, but future friends, future converts, and individuals that you certainly want to interact with them. Let me take a break because when we come back, I want to get into some of the principles, and it wouldn't surprise you at all that the first thing is to pray. And then we want to talk about, everything that you need to know about building bridges, unless you're an engineer. And then certainly, are there some needs in the bridge for repair? And then we'll get into maybe some of the lessons we can learn from Jesus, some of the lessons we can learn from Paul, as well as that. And that's all part of that first section, which is called The Art of Bridge Building. Then a little bit later in the hour, we're going to spend some time talking about building a bridge builder, becoming one, and that is issues like truth, certainly a word we use all the time, almost every day here on Point of View, friendship. Then how do we interact with people maybe that have different worldviews, maybe different religious ideas? What about some of these really vast cultural divides, almost a canyon that separates us from some individuals, and then also recognizing that sometimes some barriers are necessary, some guide rails and things of that nature. But I think you're going to find this book very helpful. And again, we are just privileged to have an individual so well educated and so articulate in these issues. So we're going to come back and talk about bridge building apologetics. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
This is Christmas week, and I thought it might be worthwhile to spend a moment to reflect on the words of the hymn, O Little Town of Bethlehem. It was written in 1867 by Philip Brooks, an Episcopal pastor from Philadelphia. He was in Israel 2 years earlier and had celebrated Christmas in Bethlehem, and he wrote this song to reflect on what that night of the birth of Jesus might be like. O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. Above thy deep and dreamless sleep the silent stars go by. Yet in the dark streets shineth the everlasting light. The hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight. You know, while the streets of our cities are quiet on Christmas Day, most likely that day was just like any other day for the people in Bethlehem. But as evening came, the town grew quiet, and something remarkable took place. In the second verse, the hymn says, "While mortals sleep, the angels keep their watch of wondering love." Just like today, our world goes about its business, usually oblivious to the spiritual realities around it. Jesus came into the world quietly. Yes, there was the angelic announcement to the shepherds, but most other people were unaware of the fact that the most significant event in history was taking place. God became man. But he was born in a stable and laid in a feeding trough. There was no pomp or circumstance as you might expect of a king. Jesus came not only to live among us, but to ultimately die for our sins. He took upon himself the sins of the world, your sins and my sins, and paid the ultimate penalty that we deserve to pay that we might have everlasting life. During this Christmas week, I hope you'll stop long enough to consider what happened in that little town of Bethlehem. But even more so, I hope you will think about what Jesus did for you on Calvary. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Lindsey Medenwaldt. And again, we're talking about bridge building apologetics, how to get along even when we disagree. Now, Lindsey, certainly one of the things you begin with is the idea of prayer, and that makes a great deal of sense. I thought it was very interesting that you talk about, well, how do I pray? Well, we can pray like Jesus. You give us that example. Pray like Paul. Certainly pray like the psalmist. And then pray like Leslie Strobel. If people aren't familiar, although I think most are, she is the wife of Lee Strobel, who's been on the program with us many times before, prayed for his salvation and the rest. And in some respects, that's important. Some of the discussions that I've been involved with over the years that develop into apologetics or preaching or teaching the gospel happen spontaneously. But when I know that I'm going to be speaking to a group, or I know I'm going to be meeting with an individual at like Half Price Bookstore or something like that, and we're going to talk about some of these important issues, it does seem to me that the first thing I need to do is to pray. And you agree?
Yes. Kerby, I didn't realize how important prayer was really until I was in seminary, which is a great place to learn that prayer is so important. I obviously have heard that prayer was important, that it should be a big part of my life, that I should pray without ceasing. But I think maybe we don't think about that in real life, right? We hear, oh, yes, we should pray all the time. But then we pray when we lose our keys, or we pray when something is wrong, and we forget to thank God for the gifts that he's given us or the opportunities to share our faith. In fact, we forget to ask God for opportunities to share our faith. I thought it was really appropriate to start this book with prayer because we so often forget that it's one of the things we have in our toolboxes as Christians. And being in constant conversation with God can ease our minds when we're in conversations with other people. I use Leslie Strobel as an example because she was praying for her husband Lee's salvation. And he appeared to have a hardened heart. And sometimes that's the case with the people we interact with, whether they're our friends or somebody we're just meeting for the first time. And Leslie spent some time every day praying Ezekiel 36:26, which basically asks God to give a person a new heart and to put the new spirit in them, and removing their heart of stone. I think so often we meet people who've converted to Christianity who said, I just didn't want anything to do with it. I had a bad experience with the church, and I didn't want any other experiences, and had completely closed themselves off to the opportunity to know Jesus personally. If we can enter the conversations knowing that we might be talking about some really difficult personal experiences on the other person's side, right? They might share some really hard things with us, but God can give us the wisdom about the words that would be appropriate for that particular person at that particular time.
Well, very good material. And again, let's, if we can, get to really kind of the theme of the book, and that is bridge building. You have a chapter, I love it, everything you need to know about bridges unless you're an engineer. And when you get into this, there's obviously a firm foundation, a strong structure, an effective structure, a structure that unites. And in some respects, that's why you chose that illustration, which is also on the cover and the back cover of your book and on many of the pages, because what you are trying to do is build a bridge. So give us a little bit of an understanding what bridge building looks like.
Yeah, reading this chapter won't make you a bridge expert. You're not going to go out and build a bridge, physical bridge, and it won't be sturdy. You really need to go to engineering school for that. But my hope was that we could look at how engineers build physical bridges and use that as a metaphor for the way that we can build bridges with people. That firm foundation, as you know, and we'll talk about in a little bit, I took that and I added it to this book as how we can build bridges. What are the firm foundations? Truth and genuine friendship. How can we have a strong structure that really begins in the theology that we hold? Do we even know what we believe? Can we articulate that with somebody else with confidence? Can we say the gospel without having to pick up our Bible and look? Practicing that can be really helpful. And then, are we effective in the way that we engage with others? This is, taking a look at ourselves as listeners. How do we listen? Do we listen well? One of the things I love to teach my students is how can we be good listeners? It's not just about the person giving the speech to get the grade. It's about, are you leaning in? Are you asking thoughtful questions? Or are you just waiting for the opportunity to speak? If you're just waiting for the opportunity to speak, you're probably going to miss something important. And my hope is that people will read this book and not think in this particular chapter and not think, okay, I can go build a physical bridge, but I feel ready to build some bridges in my life with the people around me.
This is especially important when you're dealing with people that are in maybe particular cults or world religions. Each month we provide a booklet to our donors, and of course the booklets on things like Islam, one coming out on Hinduism and the rest, really require that you ask questions, because otherwise you're going to make false assumptions. And of course, when we've had a variety of people like Greg Kokel and others on here, asking questions not only help you get more information, but then sometimes helps you begin to show maybe a logical flaw. And that brings me to your section on Jesus, the ultimate bridge builder. It's kind of intriguing to me, Lindsey, that Jesus asked lots of questions, only gave a few answers if you think about that, and questions are very important, but you actually put together 6 lessons that you can derive from Jesus in terms of building bridges. What are some of those?
Right. The first is to love God. Are we loving God with our whole selves? That matters in the way that we speak with each other, the way that we interact with our coworkers, how we do our job. Are we ethical? It's about loving God with all of our whole being. And Jesus tried to teach that in a number of ways, right? He obviously was very good at that. But he said, the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. And when I think of that, I think of it's literally all the time. Our thoughts should be full of the way that we love God. And that will play out in the way that we treat others, the words that we speak. We need to love people. Jesus did this exceedingly well. He met people where they were, even if they were hiding up in a tree, right? We see that with Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus is up in a tree. He's just trying to get a glimpse at Jesus. Jesus leaves the crowd, and he goes and speaks with Zacchaeus. And so Jesus meets us where we are. We can do the same thing, not coming in with these, like you said earlier, assumptions about someone. If they say they're an atheist, don't assume you know what they believe or don't believe. Ask them questions. That's how we can show that we care. Jesus also was gentle. I think, obviously, you've mentioned 1 Peter 3:15, and we're supposed to share the hope within us with gentleness. Jesus illustrates this in a variety of ways, the way that he talks to tax collectors, which is, of course, frustrating to the people around him. Tax collectors were the scum of the earth in many ways in those times, and they were thought of poorly. But Jesus took the time to interact with tax collectors, recognizing that he wanted to know them, and he wanted, more importantly, them to know him. He worked at bringing people together. Just look at the apostles. What a group of guys, right? People that you wouldn't normally have put together, and yet Jesus called them together, and they served him until most of them, died. He offered hope. We should not be people of despair. I don't know about you, Kerby, but sometimes when I'm looking at social media, it seems like Christians don't have hope. We've sort of joined the world in this despairing mindset. Oh, woe is us. The world is so awful. And yet, we should be the people, Christians should be those who others look at for hope. Why are you so joyful in times like this? Oh, well, that's the hope within me. I know Jesus. He's my Savior, and he's yours too. Let me tell you more about him. And then ultimately, we're going to make disciples. This may not be you sharing the gospel outright. It may be your neighbor observing you. Maybe you've invited your neighbor over to dinner, and you have a great conversation, and that leads them to asking questions. You don't have to be the center of attention in this story.
Yes.
Jesus should be the center of attention. And I think if we can keep that mindset, it makes it a lot easier to go in confidently.
Very good. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll pick up maybe just a couple of other pointers in terms of how the Apostle Paul engaged in that. And then we're going to talk about some of these firm foundations that are necessary for a bridge. And if you, as you are maybe listening to this, would like to know more about Lindsey, we have a link to her website, which will allow you to not only know about her and her book, but I also would commend to you maybe a speaking opportunity. You might want to have her come and speak to these very important issues of bridge building apologetics. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
If you have ever wondered what kind of impact you have when you give to Point of View, let me introduce you to Bill. His story is a perfect illustration.
Well, I've been a supporter of Point of View since the 70s. And I appreciate the fact that truth and love are discussed equally and that God's Word never changes. We have 4 generations in my family who have been taught these things, these truths, and the 5th generation we've just been blessed with, who I'm sure will be blessed by this ministry also. So I just appreciate the fact that it's solid, it's truthful, it's honest, and there's no changing God's Word.
And that is the kind of multi-generational impact you have when you support Point of View. So give today. Equip the next generation with the clarity of God's unchanging Word. You can give online at pointofview.net or call us at 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, Lindsey Medenwaldt with us as we talk about her book, Bridge Building Apologetics, How to Get Along Even When We Disagree. We have a link to her website, and I would encourage you to follow that. We also have links to her social media, so if you'd like to find her on Facebook or X, or formerly known as Twitter, all available there. This book published by Harvest House, you probably can find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we have a link so that you can not only find her, but you also find the book and get it in paperback or Kindle. Lindsey, we talked about Jesus, and just before we go on to some of the foundations, I thought for just a minute we might at least talk about the apostles. You have, of course, Paul. A little bit later, of course, you have Peter. After all, Peter's the one that gave us 1 Peter 3:15, and it seems to me that not only can we learn from the life of Jesus, we can learn some things, can't we, from some of the apostles, some of the disciples, on how they did apologetics as well.
Right. We shouldn't be surprised that Jesus selected people, and God ultimately selected Paul to serve him in this way. What set Paul apart, I think, and what really struck me and why I included him in this book is how willing he was to be used by God. And I think that's the key lesson in this chapter, for me at least. That's the one that I take away the most, is that in order to be used, we should be willing. And God wants us to use the gifts that he's given us. And you don't have to be the kind of person that went to seminary and studied this, to do this, to do what I'm doing. You don't have to write a book. You don't have to be a public speaker. I'm talking about those everyday life situations. And if you are willing to share the gospel and you ask God for opportunities to do so, I am a firm believer that he will give you the opportunities to do so. We see this play out in the other apostles as well. And I even give some examples from modernity of people who were willing vessels, people who wanted to share the gospel. I'm going to mention Nabil Qureshi. He was pretty formative to me in seminary. While I was in seminary, he just received his diagnosis, and he ultimately passed away. But he was a Muslim, and he was raised in a very devout Muslim family. And because of the efforts of his friend David Woods, along with others who were willing to speak truth into his life in love, Nabil became a Christian. And not only that, he began to share his faith. He was a willing vessel. And I encourage anybody who's listening to go and watch some of Nabil's last video blogs, where he shares his faith and he talks about how important it is that other people pick up the position of him, wherever he was, to share faith with his parents and others like his parents. We should be inspired by Nabil's willingness to be devoted to God. And so that's kind of the takeaways for those couple of chapters is we can be used if we are willing. And we need to be willing to kind of put ourselves out there.
One of the things I do like is that you also have some recommended readings. First of all, it ends with questions for reflection and discussion. So any of you out there that would maybe like to take Lindsey's material and use it in a small group, that is the case. But then some of the recommended resources, you of course mentioned Norm Geisler and Pat Zucker and the Apologetics of Jesus, which when that book finally came out, I knew what Pat was. Of course, he was on our staff working on that. I said, why is it taking so long for somebody to talk about the Apologetics of Jesus? Of course, you mentioned Nabil Qureshi. We actually had him in studio, in a previous studio where we were when he was still alive, talking about that, seeking Allah, finding Jesus. But since we have this idea of a bridge, I guess it's about time to build the bridge. And one of those foundational principles is truth. And we certainly talk about truth here. We have a truth team. We have a truth team week. Right now we have a theme about the idea of anchored in truth. That is very important given the fact that we have sort of this postmodern view that, well, Lindsey, you have your view of truth, and Bob has a different view of truth, and Sally has a different view of truth. And we really need to come back to this idea of biblical truth, don't we?
Yeah, one of the things that we sort of deal with here at Mama Bear Apologetics is our hope is to equip moms so they can equip their kids. But what we're hearing is that kids are coming home and saying, oh, well, I don't have to have your truth. I can believe A and you can believe B, and they can be in complete opposition of one another, but that's okay. We're still both correct. And unfortunately, that's what the world is telling our kids. And we're seeing this sort of play out as we look at the generation who's entering college and how they're grappling with public policy issues and other issues of the day. And how can we, love people well, but hold firm to truth, which I know is something that's really important at Point of View, right? Like, that's something that you emphasize. It's not always simple, is it? Because we want to be kind and gentle in our approach, but we want to be firm in the truth. So my hope is that people will begin to understand the difference between objective truth, that is true whether you like it or not, right? So 2 + 2 = 4. Whether you think it should equal 5 or 4 or whatever, it still equals 4. That's an objective truth. Subjective truth would be like your favorite color. That's where really the my truth idea works, right? So my favorite color is purple. Maybe your favorite color is blue, and that is okay. That's where I can say, oh, that's fine. That's true for you, but it's not true for me. But when we're looking at the gospel message, we need to understand, and we need to teach our children this, that is objective truth. We know that Jesus lived and died and was resurrected again. We can look at not only the scriptures for evidence of that, but we can look outside of scripture to know that that is true. So beginning to help your kids and even ourselves understand what culture thinks is true isn't necessarily true. And why do they have that perspective? This is where we unfortunately get into syncretism, right? Syncretism is a big $20 word, but basically it means we're just adding things to our spirituality. So Christians who then would maybe use crystals in their prayer life, or maybe they read their astrological signs and they really take that seriously. They're adding things that don't belong, that we don't even need to their spiritual practices. And unfortunately, culture's not going to call you out on that. We should. If we're standing firm in the faith, we should be able to have a conversation with our friend and say, hey, did you know that not only is it not scientifically accurate that crystals work, but we shouldn't actually be using those things. And here's what Scripture has to say about it.
Yes.
I think we need to be bold.
And again, you said this to maybe some parents right now, since, of course, you work with Mama Bear Apologetics. How about Mama Bear Apologetics, empowering your kids to challenge cultural lies? Mama Bear Apologetics, the guide to sexuality, empowering your kids to understand some of those key issues. Of course, I go all the way back to Lael Arrington, world-proofing your kids. There's such a need to, at the younger ages, begin to focus on some of those very important issues so that they don't buy into those lies. So again, I just want to commend to people the website that is there as well. But let's take the other part of that, because we're supposed to speak the truth in love. And oftentimes I know people that are good on the truth part, but they're not good on the second foundation you talk about, and that's friendship. And it seems to me that we need to really work on that, because sometimes we're in this midst, as you talk about in the last part of your book, in this cultural divide, and it is hard to develop friendships across the aisle, friendships across the street, friendships across this cultural divide. And that's something we're going to have to work on almost as hard as understanding some of these truth claims as well, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, Kerby, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we've sort of become a little bit okay with not having friendships. But that's not really working out for us. One of the things I discovered in my research was how important friendship really is for us. It helps us mentally, right? To have a friend that we can share our thoughts with, or our fears, or whatever it is that we have going on in our lives, even as a check-in once a week. I've got a friend who lives in Colorado that I get to have coffee with her virtually almost every week to kind of just talk about our weeks and how we're doing and some of the challenges we're experiencing. But we sort of lost that art, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic. And sometimes adults don't actually know how to make friends. We kind of get in the rhythm of our own lives, and we don't know how to even begin to add friends into our lives. And I encourage my readers to look around, right? Look already are. Maybe it's a new friend at work, or it's a new neighbor, or a neighbor that's been there for 20 years and you just haven't gotten to know them yet, which is not that uncommon, unfortunately. But maybe it's somebody at the Parent Teachers Association, or somebody at the soccer club where your kids play. Wherever you might find those friends, really nurture them. You don't have to know immediately what they believe. That's probably going to become apparent, especially if you live in a small town like I do.
Yes.
We pretty much talk about church in that first conversation. But build friendships is really, really important.
Going to continue our conversation on bridge building apologetics right after these important messages.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we talk about bridge building apologetics, how to get along even when we disagree. It is published by Harvest House, and Lindsey is with us for a few more minutes. I might just mention as we go to her website, again, you can find all the links necessary. One of the things she does is actually write on Substack, as some of the other writers that we've interviewed with Worldview Bulletin do so. I love how it says here, aliens, cults, and coffee. I cover it all. So again, lots of great material. By now, some of you are probably thinking, it would really be good to get her to come and speak at a conference or at our church or something of that nature. There is an opportunity for you to get a speaking request in. She lists a number of speaking topics. And of course, the natural one is, of course, her new book. And you can find out about her book there as well. So all sorts of information on the website. But in the few minutes we have remaining, of course, you have a chapter, as we talk about, on interacting with people of different worldviews. But it kind of gets into the broader chapter that you talk about in terms of navigating cultural divides. And another theme that we talk about so often here, Lindsey, is the cancel culture. And you have a whole reminder, goes on for about a page, of all the different people that have been canceled. And this is the difficulty I think we face. Even if we are winsome, even if we're gracious, even if we're using good logic, even if we try not to get overly emotional, the person on the other side of the conversation sometimes isn't necessarily following that pattern. But that doesn't matter, because we need to be good and gracious individuals. And it does seem to me that we're going to have a more significant challenge, don't you think, navigating some of these cultural divides?
Yes, especially if we're willing to have friends, right? Because what we're finding is that we're making friends, but they're not necessarily Christians. So how can we navigate those relationships with the people around us, and do so in a peacekeeping kind of way? Paul says to be at peace with all men. That's how he used to strive to be, right? And I'd like to continue that. But we have seen a number of people from a variety of walks, right, from all sides, canceled for one reason or another. I list some really crazy ones, but there are simple ways to get canceled too. It can just be a tweet. You could say something just completely that people totally dislike, and all of a sudden you are no longer followed or considered reputable. And I want people to toe the line between, not trying to get canceled, but also speaking truth. And there is a fine balance in our culture. I mean, we just saw the U.S. presidential election sort of play out, and how that worked out amongst neighbors. People did not get along. And my hope is that people will read this book and find ways to get along with people who have really big disagreements with one another. You can be friends with Democrats or Republicans or independents. You can be friends with Christians and non-Christians alike. It doesn't mean that you have to agree with them. One of the examples I give is, I don't know if I say it in the book, but one that I like to give frequently is, if you see a neighbor with a sign that supports a perspective,
yes,
right? Don't make the assumption that they hold it for any particular reason. Instead, if you disagree, or even if you agree, ask them why. They obviously feel strongly about it because they have a sign in their front yard. Not everybody displays signs. So there was something that made them feel very strongly about the issue that they're having a sign about in their yard. It's okay to have a conversation with them about it. Again, you don't have to change your mind on the topic. And you may not change theirs, but you could demonstrate this Christ-like attitude and behavior toward them by engaging in a conversation that is civil and respectful and kind. You may get the opportunity to share your perspective and why you agree or disagree. But asking a question is probably the best way to navigate that.
One of the things I thought was so intriguing, since we do talk about political issues here, is that it wasn't an election that ruined politics for me, you said. The turning point was the confirmation hearings for U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts, goes all the way back to 2005, who was a nominee by George W. Bush. And, of course, we've seen that since then. I could even, since I'm the old guy around the table, go all the way back to Clarence Thomas and some of those. And that is that we've recognized that there have been those divisions divisions, but now they're becoming even more visible and blatant. They now, interestingly enough, don't always necessarily draw down in terms of Republican or Democrat or even along political lines, but sometimes more along cultural lines. But if you think of the Apostle Paul, and here he is in Athens, he's standing before Mars Hill. He's actually interacting with Stoic and Epicurean philosophers with whom he has probably almost no commonality. And yet we have, of course, in Acts 17, a very persuasive presentation. And it seems to me that we can probably learn a lot more about how to do apologetics and how to preach the gospel in the 21st century by going all the way back to the first century where those same kind of divisions actually took place, don't you think?
Absolutely. And I think, we do get caught up in the moment. And I would like to encourage Christians to be Christ-like, show compassion for the people around you. This is why asking questions can be so helpful. It takes the pressure off of you, and people really do like to talk. We've all been in conversations where we feel like maybe we don't even get a word in because the other person is talking so much. Asking questions is so helpful, but we don't have to be like the world, and we shouldn't be. We should be set apart. We should be a city on a hill where the light shines brightly. And when we're building bridges, it doesn't have to be I gotcha moments all the time with the people that we're interacting with. Instead, ask them genuine questions where you can learn and grow in your own perspective. It could bolster your own faith based on what they say. And it could also challenge you to do some research and find out the answers to some of the questions that they have that you may not even know the answers to. So be open to having those conversations. I think we're so closed off right now that we're not even willing to enter the fray. And I would say we can enter the fray, but be different, be set apart. Let people know Christ through you.
Again, if you want to know how to be a bridge builder, this, I think, is a great resource for you. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, about 260 pages, 15 chapters. For those of you that maybe lead a small group, let me just mention at the end, there's a questions for reflection and discussion. You could go through that, obviously, individually, or this would be a great group study, recommended resources. And, of course, we also have a link to Lindsey Medenwaldt, and again, it is a website that is easy to achieve some great material. You might want to find out more about her speaking, also about her particular Substack that you might want to begin to subscribe to, and a variety of other things. And Lindsey, of course, heard of you before, and I'm hoping maybe we can have you back. We do a millennial roundtable, which I think I'm just going to start calling the next generation roundtable, because some of the things that you talk about in your book would be a great discussion point around the table. So again, we appreciate you writing the book, and thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much, Kerby. I really enjoyed my talk with you.
We're going to take a break, but let me just mention again that this book is entitled Bridge Building Apologetics, How to Get Along Even When We Disagree. And when we take a stand for our faith, sometimes it's going to be difficult. People are going to criticize you, but if nothing else, we should learn how to take a stand without trying to look overly combative, adversarial. And I think this is a book that will really help you understand how to do that with lots of examples and strategies and practical tips. That's what we've been talking about, and you're listening to Point of View.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
My husband and I are your supporters. We just really appreciate the show and the people you bring on.
I just want to commend you guys on your program. I love listening to you. It's a blessing. Been listening to you for several years. Your program has helped my family see current events and elections and politics through the eyes and the principles of Scripture. And that's been enlightening, and we're trying to pass that on to others.
I want to say, first of all, that I really enjoyed the Millennial Roundtable, and I love the program altogether. I think Kerby is great, and I really appreciate all of y'all, all that y'all do, and the truth that y'all put out.
Hey, great show. Love all your comments and what you're talking about.
Thanks again for what you do.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, Monday, of course, is our day in which we are focusing on a lot of news items. And, of course, the saddest news item to begin with is the shooting that has taken place there in Madison, Wisconsin at the Abundant Life Christian School. These are such sad stories. But, again, the last time I checked, 3 dead, which includes the shooter, which was one of the students at the school, 7 others transported to the hospitals, and again, trying to make any sense out of this. Of course, there'll be all sorts of claims and counterclaims, and this will be used to advance sometimes a political agenda. But I think for just a minute, we just encourage, first of all, listeners to Point of View to pray for the students affected by this, the parents and families affected by this, and oftentimes when we say we're trying to understand the motive, well, the motive was to kill people. I mean, other motives may be secondary, but that was the primary motive. And just a very sad story that we obviously have to report on day in and day out. There are sad stories around the world, and get when it touches closer to home here in the United States. Just a reminder that we are in a fallen world, and there are so many problems. We have talked on this program many times about the suicidal tendencies, the suicidal ideation, the desire to strike out, the bullying, all the other issues. We don't know all the reasons, nor do we need to know all of those. We recognize that, if anything, the hope of the gospel is one of the things we want to present, but most importantly, let me encourage you to pray for the people associated with the Abundant Life Christian School in Madison, Wisconsin. There are lots of things to cover today, so maybe take a couple of the small items. It is not a small item ultimately, but is one we'll only talk about briefly today, but probably get into more by the Friday weekend edition. And that is, we do have the bombshell report that has come out now from the Justice Department, telling us that, yes, there were quite a number of FBI agents there on January 6th. No real surprise about that, other than now we have the number, and I just wanted to at least mention that is one of those things that came out the other day. We didn't really get a chance to talk about it. It is something which we'll probably delve into deeply later, but nevertheless, just always like to mention some of those items in case somebody says, well, you didn't cover about that particular issue, or you didn't talk about this issue. We'll probably spend some time talking about that a little bit in the future. Matter of fact, I would have planned on talking about it tomorrow, but we do have a real opportunity. Penna Dexter had crossed paths with Tim Gagelein, and Tim Gagelein is an individual we've known for some time and has worked with Focus on the Family. Before that, of course, we worked with George W. Bush, and a friend of this ministry, and he has a new book out called Stumbling Towards Utopia, and he asked her if she would do an interview with him on his book, which I thought was a great idea for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think very highly of him. Number two, one of the comments I get from people, sometimes even a complaint, We don't hear from Penna very often. Well, part of that is due to the busyness of Penna Dexter and Todd Dexter's life. But this is an opportunity for you to hear from her tomorrow. And she'll be doing an interview with him on the 1 hour program, or the first hour, I should say. And then the second hour, a little bit of time with Mike Ferris about the so-called Johnson Amendment. So there'll be some great material that will be covered tomorrow. So we may get to a few of these other issues when I'm back sitting in front of this microphone on Wednesday, but I think you will really enjoy the conversation tomorrow. Real quickly, I'll mention something else, not get into a lot of the detail. But there was a defamation suit that former president, now President-elect Donald Trump, brought against ABC. And he has won that suit at a level of $15 million for defamation, basically against George Stephanopoulos. And, of course, you may remember the story about claiming that he had been found guilty of rape and had not. And, of course, it's interesting because I've been hearing some other interviews that have been done with the president-elect about other lawsuits either he has brought or will bring because he really wants to not make money. I think he's doing fine financially, but to make the case that the media has been very corrupt. One of the ones he continually seems to be talking about is the fact that, if you don't remember, the New York Times reporters won a Pulitzer Prize for their coverage of what we now know is the Russian hoax. And so as a result, he thinks that they should not only pull back the award, but also in some respects provide a reward as well. So anyway, those are some topics we'll get into, and it also relates very much to some of the other articles we'll get into later about why there are individuals who have traditionally been supporters of the Democratic Party who nevertheless this time backed Donald Trump. And one of those is why a tech titan actually backed Trump. Also one I've got by Melissa Henson on Congress, will you stand up to big tech? So some of it has to do with big tech. Some of it has to do with the mainstream media. So whether it's the legacy media or social media, we've got some problems. And that's ultimately, again, why we hope that you support Point of View, because even in this first hour where we were talking with Lindsey Medenwaldt about truth, it is important that we really do understand how important truth is and how much truth has been maligned in our culture. So again, we've got all sorts of information that I have posted for you today. My Viewpoints commentary, or take action item, which let me just mention real quickly now, which we'll get into maybe a little bit later in this latter part of this hour, because we are headed towards a possible government shutdown. That is back in September when the United States Senate said, well, we need to pass a continuing resolution to fund the government. They passed it 78-18, but it only extended to December 20th. Now, I'm of the opinion that there is not going to be a shutdown sometime, maybe even right now. Congress will extend it. But I thought, let's not just use this to tell your two senators that we need to fund the government into 2025, but also let's tell our senators, most of whom will still be there after we, of course, change out from the old Senate to the new Senate, because we've elected some new senators, that we need to actually pass a budget for fiscal year 2024-2025. If you're not familiar, the House of Representatives gets partial credit because occasionally the House of Representatives has passed a budget. But in every case, when it's passed a budget, the Senate has not passed its budget. Let's hope that now maybe when we change from leadership from Democrats to Republicans, that happens. And so this is an opportunity for you to take an action. Number one, to say we need to fund the government into 2025, but more important, we need to pass a budget. So that's one of them. Of course, we have also a video by Dr. Jack Graham on the Jesus book and all sorts of information about Pray for America. We put that out once a week of some very important prayer targets. Of course, we have the Point of View highlights on Spotify, and also a way you can listen to the program on Apple. All of that is available at the website. We come back, though, we're going to talk about how Israel has turned the Middle East around. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
This is Christmas week, and I thought it might be worthwhile to spend a moment to reflect on the words of the hymn, O Little Town of Bethlehem. It was written in 1867 by Philip Brooks, an Episcopal pastor from Philadelphia. He was in Israel 2 years earlier and had celebrated Christmas in Bethlehem, and he wrote this song to reflect on what that night of the birth of Jesus might be like. O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. Above thy deep and dreamless sleep the silent stars go by. Yet in the dark streets shineth the everlasting light. The hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight. You know, while the streets of our cities are quiet on Christmas Day, most likely that day was just like any other day for the people in Bethlehem. But as evening came, the town grew quiet, and something remarkable took place. In the second verse, the hymn says, While mortals sleep, the angels keep their watch of wondering love. Just like today, our world goes about its business, usually oblivious to the spiritual realities around it. Jesus came into the world quietly. Yes, there was the angelic announcement to the shepherds, but most other people were unaware of the fact that the most significant event in history was taking place. God became man. But he was born in a stable and laid in a feeding trough. There was no pomp or circumstance as you might expect of a king. Jesus came not only to live among us, but to ultimately die for our sins. He took upon himself the sins of the world, your sins and my sins, and paid the ultimate penalty that we deserve to pay that we might have everlasting life. During this Christmas week, I hope you'll stop long enough to consider what happened in that little town of Bethlehem. But even more so, I hope you will think about what Jesus did for you on Calvary. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Meg, once again, let's, if we can, talk about the Middle East for a few minutes. Almost everything else is going to be sort of domestically oriented, but I thought this particular piece by Barton Swain would be helpful. It is entitled, rather provocatively, How Israel Turned the Middle East Around. And he says, no one knows whether the new Syrian government will generate fresh trouble or find its way to peace and stability. I think the former is more likely than the latter, but we'll see. He says that the fall of the house of Assad is an inherently good thing, however, is certain for more than 50 years, first under Hafez al-Assad, which we talked about last week, and since 2000 under his son Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian government has brutalized the country's citizens and allied itself with maligned regimes around the globe. Then he goes on to make a rather dramatic statement. Two nations deserve most of the credit for the fall of Bashar al-Assad. And alas, they don't include the United States. They are Ukraine and Israel. At this point, you've got to say, where are we going with this? He says Ukraine for preoccupying Vladimir Putin's Russia, and Israel for preventing Iran's intervention by degrading Tehran's military and humiliating its proxy in Lebanon, Hezbollah. I'll spend some time looking at each one of those, but I think it's interesting because it illustrates again that all sorts of different hotspots and various kinds of conflicts many times are interrelated. He says, just as Ukraine wouldn't have troubled Russia if Russia hadn't invaded it, Israel wouldn't have decapitated Hezbollah, ravaged Iran's air defenses, and destroys Tehran's client in Gaza, Hamas, other than because of the October 7th, 2023 attacks. Unlike Ukraine, however, Israel has been at war with America's foes since the founding in 1984. You know, one of the things that Barton Swain says is critics used to complain about the so-called Israel lobby and its supposed ability to bend U.S. policy to its will. He said a better or more sane case could be made that Israel is constantly doing America's dirty work at immense cost to itself. For example, you think of its war right now against Hamas and Hezbollah isn't just a regional conflict over disputed territory, but it really is a battle against those who have put together this axis of evil, those are my words, not his, against many of these democracies around the world. And so then he goes and tells kind of an intriguing story, because he talks about having taken the time to meet with Ron Dermer. You might say, okay, who's he? Well, it turns out that Ron Dermer is the Minister for Strategic Affairs with what? Israel. And so he begins by even saying some of the things he just mentioned. I mentioned a minute ago. He says, I begin by mentioning my view that Israel is fighting America's war in the Middle East. And, of course, Ron Dermer doesn't surprise me because he agrees. He says, we're the little Satan. That's exactly how Benjamin Netanyahu refers to Israel. And Benjamin Netanyahu also says America is the big Satan. And so as a result, Europe is annoyed because it's only the medium-sized Satan. I love that line. But nevertheless, he recognizes that in some respects, Israel has been taking out Iran or the Iranian proxies, and because of that, that made it even more likely that Syria would fall. He talks about the turnaround. Again, this article goes on for pages. I'm only going to really give you a brief summary of the first three. But if you would like to read more about it, it's, of course, our second article on the website. And he talks about the turnaround. He says it started with a string of attacks and strikes that humiliated Iran and its proxies in Lebanon and Gaza. On July 30th, Israel killed Hezbollah leader Fouad Shakir in an airstrike. And earlier the following morning, also killed the Hamas political chief Ismail Haniyeh, who we talked about on this program as well, by detonating a bomb somehow hidden in a hotel room in Tehran. Remember, we talked about that. And he says a few weeks later, in an exploit that you might dismiss as impossible if you read it in a Robert Ludlum novel, or I might even say in a James Bond film, the Israelis detonated pagers and walkie-talkies carried by thousands of Hezbollah operatives, devices that had been sold to Hezbollah by a fake company set up years earlier by Israel for such a time as this. And then you have in late September an Israeli airstrike that killed Hezbollah's Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah. And then 2 weeks later, an Israeli patrol in Gaza killed the legendary elusive Yahya Sinwar, the architect of the October 7th attack. And again, he says, it occurs to me that no other first world nation, with the exception maybe of the United States, in the months after September 11, possesses the shrewdness and sheer audacity of what you have taking place there in Israel. What the point he's making is that Israel literally has turned around the Middle East, and just a great illustration of the fact that we should, in many cases, be supporting Israel rather than condemning it. Yet there are still those young people out on the streets that want to condemn what Israel is doing. But that has changed the Middle East focus in dramatic ways. Well, that's all we'll talk about in terms of the Middle East, because I want to spend some time talking about big tech. It deserves some attention. And that brings us to actually our first article, which is written by Michael Barone. He's been on the program with us before, but he's talking about an individual by the name of Mark Andreessen. Now, I'm familiar with him because I kind of follow some of the tech news and some of the stuff about Bitcoin and crypto and the rest. Most of you might not know him, but let me introduce him because he actually is the inventor of the first internet web browser. So now you browse the internet with all sorts of devices, but back then, that was the first. He's also a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. And again, Michael Barone says, why did he switch from his long-standing support of the Democratic Party and go out and back President-elect Donald Trump this year? And he says, according to Michael Barone, because in his view, the Democrats who claim to be the great scourge of disinformation are actually threatening to embed in disinformation into the bedrock of society. He says, at least that's my interpretation, Michael Barone says, of Andreessen's comments in a wide-ranging interview with the free speech co-founder Barry Weiss, who, by the way, I might just mention, used to write some of the editorials or oversee some of the editorials in the New York Times. And he said, now I'm quoting from Mark Andreessen, the big tech individual, my concern is that the censorship and political control of AI is 1,000 times more dangerous than censorship and political control of social media, maybe 1,000,000 times more dangerous. He goes on, he says, the problem with AI is I think AI is going to be the control layer for everything in the future. By the way, I've heard other people say that as well. How the healthcare system works, how the education system works, how the government works. So if AI is woke, biased, censored, politically controlled, you're in a hyper-Orwellian China-style social credit system nightmare. And so that's kind of the point he's making. I also watched an interview that Mark Andreessen did with Joe Rogan, in which he was talking about the number of leading lights in Silicon Valley that have been debanked. Now, again, if you're not familiar with debanked, I've done commentaries on it. We've done all sorts of discussions about it. It's where we say, well, we can't really control you, so we'll just not let you have access to the banking system. That was tried years ago. The federal government, if you're liberal, can't get rid of the Second Amendment, but you can debank individuals that actually sell guns or ammunition. Well, now debanking has been used to attack anybody that you might disagree with. Maybe somebody that actually believes that the virus came, as Michael Barone talks about here, from, I don't know, maybe the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Or maybe you believe that the laptop of Hunter Biden is actually his laptop and disagree with the 51 current or former intelligence officials that said it had all the earmarks of Russian disinformation. The point is you're starting to see some individuals who have been traditional donors and supporters of the Democratic Party, a lot of them in Silicon Valley, who all of a sudden found themselves on the wrong side of the Biden administration and said, we never thought we'd say this, but we are actually going to turn around and support Donald Trump. And that, I think, is a very striking change. And that's why I thought you might want to read this very good piece by our friend Michael Barone, Free Speech, Why a Tech Titan Backed Trump. It's our first article on the website. I encourage you to read it. We'll come back with more right after this.
If you have ever wondered what kind of impact you have when you give to Point of View, let me introduce you to Bill. His story is a perfect illustration.
Well, I've been a supporter of Point of View since the 70s, and I appreciate the fact that truth and love are discussed equally and that God's Word never changes. We have 4 generations in my family who have been taught these things, these truths, and the 5th generation we've just been blessed with, who I'm sure will be blessed by this ministry also. So I just appreciate the fact that it's solid, it's truthful, it's honest, and there's no changing God's Word.
And that is the kind of multi-generational impact you have when you support Point of View. So give today. Equip the next generation with the clarity of God's unchanging Word. You can give online at pointofview.net or call us at 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to read a little bit more about some of the things you're talking about, those articles are available on our website at pointofview.net. You can just simply go to the page pointofview.net, see the button that says See More, click on that, and then you can scroll down and find all sorts of information. Of course, we have the information about Lindsey Medenwaldt and also the book Bridge Building Apologetics. We have the various articles on free speech, how Israel turned the Middle East around. Going to now talk about Congress and big tech and also the issue of tariffs. And before we're done, probably have to talk about the unfriendly skies. This whole drone issue has really gotten big, so we'll get into that. Probably we'll cover it a little bit more later in the week as well, as certainly as hopefully we know a little bit more. But all of it available at the website pointofview.net. And if you value the kind of news, information, commentary that we make available to you, I might just mention that we have a banner on the website right now which says, Give the Gift of Truth, and we also have a matching challenge. Sometimes people say, well, I'll wait till the last day to see if you have a matching challenge. Well, we already have it there. So if you're one of those people, and we do have a lot of people in this audience that like to wait till the last day or the last few days, that's fine. You can procrastinate, but if you want to join with us right now and get and take advantage of that match, because it's at least theoretically possible we might run out of match by the end of this month, then you might want to give now, and there's a button that you can click on that says Give Now and help us out financially as we want to finish off this year in good financial shape. Let's, if we can, get into a couple of other issues. I've already kind of been pounding big tech. I think I might do it just one more time because of this very good article by Melissa Henson. You might remember her. She is the Vice President of Parents Television and Media Council. Oftentimes, she tends to be on with Penna Dexter. Penna's always a good friend of hers. I've had her on too, but I might just mention that sometimes I leave that to some of the interviews that Penna likes to do. And she is asking a very good question. Congress, will you stand up to big tech? It's similar to an article I probably will post on Wednesday. There's this open letter being sent right now to the possible, because, again, we have to go through Senate confirmation, but the possible Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., in which in the open letter it's suggesting that if indeed Robert Kennedy becomes Secretary Kennedy of the Health and Human Services, HHS, that one of the things he should do is work with the FCC chairman to try to prevent so much of the big pharma ads on various forms of media. The argument being made that when you spend that much money, it really kind of constrains the ability of the media to be independent and to maybe raise some very good questions about what big pharma is doing. Well, this is the same kind of argument that Melissa Henson is raising as well, because she begins by saying every month we read news stories about teenagers who were harmed or even died as a result of something that happened to them because they were on social media. Whether it was sexual extortion, fentanyl-laced drugs, algorithms that pushed an eating disorder, even suicide or whatever. These are horrific stories, but she points out that even worse, instead of taking responsibility, she says the digital and social media platforms have actively lobbied against legislation like the Kids Online Safety Act that would protect children online. She goes on to say that the Wall Street Journal reported that Meta and Alphabet's Google unit have poured nearly $90 million over the past 3 years into lobbying out a range of topics that includes this bill, according to federal disclosures. And her argument is simply this: $90 million versus our children, our kids don't stand a chance. She points out that what has happened because of that is big tech, she argues, has spread misinformation to both Democrats and Republicans in the attempt to kill the bill. But again, this particular bill, Kids Online Safety Act, does not censor content, and it ensures that tech platforms have a duty to protect children with a duty to care. Right now, they have no necessarily incentive to do so. And she reminds us that the harms and the risks to our children using social media are great. Here's just a few examples. We know that suicide is the second leading cause of death among children and young teens in America. The U.S. Surgeon General has warned about the looming mental health crisis facing youth. And again, new data suggests that the suicide rates rose in 2021, especially for even males aged 15 to 24. Recently, another study found that the more screen time is linked to mental health risk for tweens. Researchers found that the more time kids ages 9 to 10 spent with screens, the higher the risk for depression and all sorts of other issues. That goes a very long list. She also points out this isn't news to the tech groups. We know that Meta, that's the parent company of Facebook and Instagram, had an internal investigation that revealed, and this is now the quote, "We make body image issues worse for 1 to 3 teen girls." That's a quote. Another quote, "Teens blame Instagram for increases in the rates of anxiety and depression," unquote. So again, those are their quotes in their study. We also know that staffers have warned Meta that its subscription feature enabled child exploitation. She also goes on to say, we also know that TikTok knew exactly how many videos it takes for a teen to become addicted to its platform. And they also knew that teens as young as 15 were being paid by adults to strip on TikTok's live features. She says basically the bottom line is this. These tech companies know their product is putting children in harm's way, and they do nothing to mitigate the harm. We may come back to, once again, maybe seeing if in the new session of Congress, maybe we have hopefully some more enlightened voices that can once again look at the Kids Online Safety Act and recognize that this is dangerous. And the argument that, well, children just need to stay off those platforms. Parents need to control those platforms with their kids is not the answer. And as much as we're not big around this table for calling for more regulation, we are calling for more accountability. And I think the time has come for big tech. So enough on the big tech issue. I'll probably do a commentary on it. Pretty sure Penedexter is going to do one as well. But nevertheless, that's another issue that you might want to pay attention to. It's our third article on the website. And before we take a break, let me just mention the fourth article real quickly. And that is the fact that we are, again, going to have a real ongoing battle about tariffs. If you've listened to this program, you know that we're not convinced that tariffs are the ultimate answer, but tariffs can be a weapon and maybe are a very effective way to get the attention of some of the individuals in some of these other countries around the world to pay attention. And of course, the other day when the president-elect Donald Trump was on Meet the Press, he was arguing that the tariffs should cost Americans nothing, and yet he also said we can't guarantee that, which led, of course, to all the opponents of Donald Trump to say, well, the tariff is a tax. Remember that line that came? Because when they used to, at the Democratic Convention, say, Donald Trump's going to raise your taxes, I'm going, where is this coming from? Oh, I see. If he's calling for a tariff, that's a tax. Well, first of all, real quickly, this article, I think, summarizes this very well. Ben Salas points out there's two kinds of tariffs. One is a protective tariff, which is aimed primarily to safeguard specific commerce sectors, and we have a lot of those already. And the second time is a tariff designed to primarily increase revenue. And he points out that not every tariff is a tax, because a tax by definition is a measure designed to raise revenue, and that isn't necessarily the case. And then points out that if indeed there is going to be an impact of tariffs, first of all, the impact might be felt the greatest by Canada, Mexico and especially communist China, but there are reasons to believe that it might affect the American consumer, but there are also reasons to believe in light of past experiences, it may not be as devastating or as impactful as many of the particular critics say. I won't get into all the details. I think probably sometime once we have the president in office, we'll cover this issue of tariffs in more detail. But I just wanted you to know that there are reasonable answers to some of the arguments being made that tariffs are going to hurt the American people. I think the tariffs may be a very effective weapon in the hands of incoming President Donald Trump. So we'll continue to watch it, and we'll talk about it again in the future. Let's take a break. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and we're going to spend some time talking about the drones. Just before we do so, let me just mention that this week before Christmas is kind of a Christmas week, and so I thought it would be appropriate once again to actually have some commentaries. My one today is O Little Town of Bethlehem, and I might just mention that tomorrow will be Hark the Herald Angels Sing, Emmanuel, I Heard the Bells, which is a new one that I've created, as well as Mary Did You Know on Friday, the next week, the first Noel, Holy Night, and all the rest. And so did want to at least acknowledge that as we get closer to the Christmas season, we would certainly talk about some things related to Christmas, as we have over the last couple of weeks. We did, of course, one on the Christmas idea, the Advent towards Christmas, and we've also done a couple of others that are related to that. And, of course, there is a lot taking place right now, not the least of which I thought I'd end with a brief discussion about the drones. On Friday, I did post this piece by Steve Gruber. We didn't really get to it, called The Unfriendly Skies. And he says, there's a line in Hollywood that nobody knows anything. Well, it's probably, he says, true about politics. No one at the White House seems to know anything either. And here's the issue. No Democrat knows if Iran has a mothership in the Atlantic, or whether the drones over the skies of New Jersey, now I might add Maryland, are a threat rather than a nuisance. Regardless of who is responsible, Iran now knows that it is easy to breach our airspace. Ditto for China and Mexico's drug cartels. Ditto for illegals and Islamists in the United States. So much for our $1 trillion defense budget. So much for the Air Force or the Navy or the National Guard or the Coast Guard. So much for the FAA or the FBI or any federal agency in charge of safety or law enforcement. That's how he begins his piece. It goes down from there, again, quoting different individuals at the time. And I think you have seen now an editorial that has come out more recently from the Wall Street Journal, which has the title Drones and the Cost of Lost Trust, because they point out, the editors of the Wall Street Journal point out, that the loss of public trust in U.S. institutions is well chronicled, and, for example, of its costs considering the national mini panic over unidentified aerial objects. No one in America seems to believe that anyone in authority says about them, and unproven claims are filling the vacuum. Thousands of Americans who aren't cranks have seen drones or what they think are drones overhead. New Jersey, of all places, is a hotbed of sightings for reasons no one has been able to explain, but sightings have occurred across the Northeast as well as California. Military facilities and critical infrastructure sites seem to be the targets if the eyewitnesses are right. And, of course, in that first article by Steve Gruber, he points out, remember the Chinese spy balloon that traveled over the United States? And, of course, then the editors of the Wall Street Journal say, yet no one in Washington seems to be able to convincingly explain the sightings. I'm going to try to mention the four possibilities in just a minute. A joint statement that came out from the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security said, quote, "We have no evidence at this time that the reported drone sightings pose a national security or public safety threat or have a foreign nexus." Because, as we pointed out the other day, shortly after you had the statement that came from one member of Congress, and that would be Congressman Jeff Van Drew, who is a congressman or member of Congress from New Jersey, used to be a Democrat, then became a Republican, if nothing else, actually made the case that there was a mothership off of the East Coast. That was quickly tamped down by the Pentagon and even by Karine Jean-Pierre in the White House. But when you don't know what it is, then how can you come to the very dogmatic claim that they pose no national security threat, no public safety threat, and aren't of foreign origin? So, nevertheless, that is the case. You have had some really disastrous things. You had at Stewart International Airport, which is in the Hudson Valley of New York, had to shut down its runways for an hour because of what was up in the sky there on Friday night. You've had some other claims of other airports that have been affected by this, and so we are dealing with all sorts of choices. I know that we'll have our Millennial Roundtable again on Thursday. Last time they engaged in all sorts of speculation, so I'll leave it to them to speculate. But our good friend Jim Garrity has a couple of explanations, four that you can come up with. First of all, what people are seeing could be our drones. At least one individual has pointed out that if you look at this flying object up there, one of those so-called drones, it has a stubby nose, straight wings, and a long tail with dual forked fins. So some are saying, you know what that probably is it's one of the Pterodynamics XP4 transwing drones. So it's actually one of ours. And I don't know why the government couldn't just say, well, it's one of ours, especially given the fact it's over a military base. And you could say, well, we were doing some reconnaissance, or we were practicing, or we were actually doing a test flight. That could end it pretty quickly. So even though that's one explanation, it's not one that really rests very well. The second is what we're seeing are other people's drones. And of course, I quoted from Jeff Van Drew. He said, these are from highly imported sources, that these are not hobbyist drones. And so it is a possibility that indeed it's coming either from Iran or China. We know that China has made a deal with Iran to purchase drones, motherships, and technology. So that is a possibility. And some people still think that it is, and yet we've just been told confidently by the Pentagon that that's not the case. So then the third explanation is, well, what they're seeing are not drones or aircraft at all. You have this one video by Larry Hogan saying, well, these are just two stars in the Orion constellation. I'm trying to keep a straight face when I'm doing this, but this one's tough for me. We, as you well know, have a Day 4 ministry that we oftentimes work with, Parker Eng and others. We go out there and we do Star Watch parties, and I'm thinking I pretty much know where the Orion constellation is and what those stars are, which leads us to the fourth explanation. And of course, the alien people love this, and that is these are alien spacecraft. And the only answer I can give to that is, if these are aliens looking for intelligent life, why are they hanging out in New Jersey? No, that's only a joke. Although I don't think we have a radio station in New Jersey, so probably can get away with that. But, that's the joke everybody's been using. If indeed these are aliens, why are they only in New Jersey? Well, it turns out now they're also in Maryland and some other places. But nevertheless, we'll get to that probably someday. But I am struck by the fact that in the past, when the various members of the federal government confidently told us that the virus could not have come from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It must have come from a wet market. We found out that as confident as they were completely wrong. And you might even read the piece by Michael Barone, because he goes into that in some detail in his particular issue about free speech as well. But we're just simply out of time before we're out of content. Let me first of all say, Doug, thank you for engineering the program. Appreciate you being there covering for Megan. You might say, where is Megan? Well, Megan is producing the program. So you might wonder where Steve is. Well, he's actually out acting right now in, I believe, a science fiction film, but he'll be back soon enough. So I want to thank Doug and Megan for the help behind the scenes. See you back here tomorrow on Point of View.
London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday, in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just wanted to tell you, too, how much I have appreciated Point of View over the years. I've always been taught that we take care of our own, and I feel like Point of View is one of our own because of the Christian worldview that you do promote. And so I have become a partner today, and I just want to thank you so much, and just God bless you for all that you do.
Listen, I wanted to make a quick comment. I'm a relatively new listener to the show, and I really kind of stumbled upon it more than anything because I'm doing some driving now that I wasn't in the past. And my comment really is, I think you guys and gals are more right on about the assessment of this country right now than anything I've heard. You know, I go home and I tell my wife, you've got to hear what they're talking about on the show. It's just so right on. And I tell my parents the same thing.
I'm 25 years old, and I started listening to Point of View about 4 years ago, and it has changed the way that I think and the way that I view the world around me.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.